the signature she never gave. "Your mother's tired, Natalie. This isn't a good time," Gerald Voss said it standing in the doorway of my mother's own dining room, one hand braced against the frame like a man guarding a checkpoint instead of hosting a birthday party. Behind him, through the gap in the door, I could see the table set with her good china, 75 candles that someone, not him, had actually bothered to count out onto a sheet cake, and my mother, Ruth, sitting very still at the head of the table with her hands folded in her lap, the way she used to fold them at church, when she didn't want anyone to see them shaking. There were maybe 30 people in that house. Her book club, 2 women from her old bridge group. My daughter Piper, 22, standing near the kitchen with a soda she wasn't drinking, watching me over the rim of it, and Gerald, 68 years old, silver-haired, golf-tanned, standing in the doorway of a house he'd lived in for exactly 14 months telling me, his wife's only daughter, that it wasn't a good time to see her. "I drove 2 hours, Gerald. I understand that. But she's had a big day, and I don't want her overstimulated." Behind him, my mother's eyes found mine over his shoulder. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I'd spent 30 years reading that woman's face across courtrooms, kitchen tables, and hospital waiting rooms, and what I saw in it that afternoon wasn't confusion. It wasn't the fog people expect when they hear the word overstimulated. It was fear, small and carefully hidden, the kind she'd learned to fold up neatly so it wouldn't show. I didn't argue with him. I didn't raise my voice or push past him into that dining room, though every instinct I had told me to. "That's fine," I said instead. "Tell her I said happy birthday, and tell her I'll see her Monday morning at Dana Okafor's office." Something crossed Gerald's face for exactly half a second. Not confusion, calculation. He didn't know who Dana Okafor was. He was about to. "Who? She'll know," I said, and turned and walked back to my car. Because what Gerald Voss didn't understand yet was that I had spent the last 7 months quietly building a case file thick enough to end whatever he thought he'd already won. This isn't really a story about a birthday party. It's a story about the difference between a man who marries a woman and a man who marries her assets, and about how long it can take an entire family to notice which one they're dealing with. My name is Natalie Prescott. I was 46 years old that afternoon, standing in my mother's driveway in a town outside Asheville, North Carolina, and for 18 years I had worked as a geriatric care paralegal, which meant I spent my professional life helping other families untangle exactly the kind of situation I was watching happen inside my own mother's house. I want you to understand that irony fully, because I certainly have. My father died when I was 31, a heart attack in the garage while he was looking for a socket wrench, gone before the ambulance made it halfway up our street. My mother, Ruth, was 58 then, and for the better part of a decade after that, she built a life I was genuinely proud of. She traveled with her book club. She took up watercolor painting badly and joyfully. She kept my father's tool bench exactly as he'd left it, not out of grief exactly, more out of the specific loyalty widows sometimes have toward the ordinary objects of a marriage. I never once expected her to remarry, and I want to be honest that this wasn't because I thought she was too old for love. It's because I knew my mother, and I knew that after 34 years married to a quiet, steady man, she wasn't looking for anything. Which is exactly why Gerald Voss's arrival in her life 2 years ago should have concerned me more than it did. They met at a community center painting class. He was recently widowed himself, or so he said. Charming in the specific, practiced way of a man who has learned that grieving widowers make excellent first impressions on lonely women. He complimented her work. He remembered small details from conversation, weeks later. He showed up early to things and stayed late helping clean up. My mother called me after their 3rd date, laughing in a way I hadn't heard from her in years, and told me he'd brought her tulips because he remembered she mentioned once, offhand, that lilies made her sneeze. I was happy for her. I want that on the record because everything that follows might make it sound like I was suspicious from the start. I wasn't. I liked Gerald at first in the mild, low-stakes way you like your mother's new boyfriend. When you've decided being supportive matters more than being cautious. They married 8 months after they met, in a small ceremony at the same community center where they'd painted their first badly proportioned still lifes. I stood up for her, Piper cried, the good kind of crying. Gerald gave a toast about second chances that made half the room tear up, including me. It took almost a year for the small things to start accumulating into something I couldn't ignore anymore. The first thing I noticed, though I didn't understand its weight at the time, was that Gerald never once asked about my father. Not his name, not how he died, not what kind of man he'd been. My mother's house was full of him. Photographs, his old recliner she refused to replace, the tool bench in the garage. And Gerald moved through all of it like a man carefully avoiding a subject rather than a man simply uninterested. I told myself grief made people awkward around other people's grief. I filed it away. The second thing was smaller and stranger. At a family dinner about 10 months into the marriage, my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd been having trouble finding her checkbook. Gerald had laughed warmly and said he'd started keeping the household finances together in one place to make things simpler for her. My mother had smiled and nodded, and I remember thinking at the time that it sounded thoughtful. A husband helping his wife with tedious paperwork. It didn't occur to me to ask which accounts exactly, together in one place, meant. Then the calls started thinning out. My mother had called me twice a week for years, sometimes just to describe a bird at her feeder or complain about a book club selection. Over the following months, twice a week became once a week, then became sporadic, then became mostly texts, short ones, oddly formal in a way that didn't sound like her. Doing well. Gerald and I are busy. Talk soon. My mother had never in her life used the phrase talk soon. She said things like, call me Tuesday, I'll have gossip. Piper noticed before I did, which I still feel some shame about. She'd stopped by Ruth's house unannounced one Saturday to drop off a jar of her grandmother's favorite jam from a farmer's market, and she called me that night sounding unsettled in a way that wasn't like her. Mom, something's weird over there. Weird how? Grandma seemed happy to see me, but Gerald kept, hovering. Every time she started telling me a story, he'd jump in and finish it for her, or he'd change the subject, and there were sticky notes everywhere. On the fridge, on the bathroom mirror. Little reminders. Take pills 8 a.m. Gerald picks up prescriptions Tuesday. It felt like she was being managed. I told Piper that a lot of couples develop systems as they get older, that reminders weren't sinister, that Gerald was probably just being helpful. I believed what I was saying when I said it. I want to be honest about that too, because I think it matters, later, that I gave him the benefit of every doubt available to a devoted daughter before I gave him none at all. The real shift happened around the 14-month mark, not long before that birthday party. My mother had a minor fall in her kitchen. Nothing serious, a bruised hip, nothing broken, but it required an ER visit, and I drove up immediately. When I got there, Gerald was already speaking to the attending physician in the hallway in a low, confidential tone, and I overheard him say something that stopped me cold. She's been having more memory lapses lately, getting confused about medications, forgetting conversations. I just want you to note that in her chart, in case it's relevant. My mother, sitting up in the hospital bed 20 feet away, had not, as far as I knew, had a single memory lapse in her life, beyond the ordinary kind everyone has at 74. When I asked her directly, later that night, whether she'd been forgetting things, she looked at me like I'd asked something absurd. No more than usual, she said. Why? Did Gerald say something? I told her it was nothing. I have regretted that answer more than almost anything else in this entire story, because it was the moment I first understood clearly that something was being constructed around my mother. A narrative, quietly, carefully, one hallway conversation at a time. And I still chose, that night, to protect her feelings instead of asking the harder question. I didn't make that mistake again. I called Dana Okafor 2 weeks later. Dana was an elder law attorney I'd worked alongside for years in my own job, sharp, unhurried, the kind of person who'd seen every version of this particular story and had stopped being surprised by any of them. "Tell me what you've got," she said. When I sat across from her in her office with a legal pad I hadn't yet written anything on, I told her about the finances Gerald had simplified, the sticky notes, the ER hallway conversation, the calls that had thinned into stilted texts. Dana listened without interrupting, the way good attorneys do when they're already sensing a shape to something the client hasn't fully named yet. "Has he mentioned power of attorney? Guardianship? Anything about her competency formally? Not to me. Would your mother tell you if he had?" That question sat with me longer than I expected it to. "I don't know anymore," I admitted. "She's stopped telling me a lot of things." Dana nodded slowly. "That's actually the most useful thing you've said so far." She explained something I hadn't fully understood until she said it plainly, that financial and emotional isolation of an elderly spouse rarely happens all at once. It happens exactly the way I described. Access consolidated a little at a time, communication narrowed a little at a time, a paper trail quietly built suggesting confusion or incapacity, so that if anyone ever challenges the arrangement later, there's already a documented narrative in place to explain it away. "I want you to start writing things down," Dana said. "Everything. Dates, conversations, anything he says about her memory or her health, especially to anyone outside the family, doctors, neighbors, bank tellers. And I want you to find out carefully what accounts have actually been restructured since the marriage." That was harder than it sounds. My mother had always been fiercely private about money, a habit from a generation that considered discussing finances impolite even with family. But Piper, in the specific, unbothered way 22-year-olds sometimes accomplish things 46-year-olds overthink, simply asked her grandmother directly one afternoon, over coffee, in the gentle, curious tone of someone asking about the old days rather than conducting an investigation. "Grandma, did you and Gerald combine your bank accounts when you got married?" My mother had hesitated. Piper told me later that the hesitation itself felt strange, before saying that Gerald had suggested it made things easier, and that she'd signed some papers about a year ago that she honestly couldn't fully recall the details of anymore. "I trust him with it," she'd added. In the specific, over-quick way people say things they're not entirely sure of anymore. That sentence, more than anything else, was what sent me to the county recorder's office the following week. What I found took 3 visits and several hours of records I had every legal right to access as a documented family member assisting with elder affairs, but that Gerald clearly hadn't expected anyone to bother checking. 8 months into the marriage, my mother's house, paid off free and clear since before my father died, appraised at just under $400,000, had been quitclaimed into a joint tenancy with Gerald, with rights of survivorship. That meant, in plain terms, that if my mother died first, the house would pass entirely to Gerald, bypassing me and Piper completely, regardless of what her prior will said. Her prior will, which I'd helped her update myself 6 years earlier after my father's estate settled, left the house to me, in trust for Piper eventually. That will had never been formally revoked. But the deed transfer meant it wouldn't matter. Deeds override wills when it comes to real property held in joint tenancy. I sat in my car outside the recorder's office for a long time after finding that document, doing the kind of math I'd done professionally for other families 100 times and had never once imagined doing for my own. That wasn't the only thing I found. A separate search of my mother's retirement accounts, accessible through statements Piper had noticed, unopened, in a drawer during another visit, and photographed before quietly putting back exactly where she'd found them, showed that Gerald had been added as a co-owner on an investment account 11 months earlier, an account that had previously been solely my mother's, funded by decades of my father's teaching pension and her own modest savings. And there was one more thing, smaller, but the one that finally made my hands go cold reading it. A notarized document, filed with a local title company, establishing Gerald as my mother's designated healthcare power of attorney and financial power of attorney, dated only 6 weeks earlier, with a notary signature I didn't recognize and a witness signature. My mother's own hand, unmistakably, but shakier than I'd ever seen it look on any document she'd signed in her life. I brought all of it to Dana the following week. "This is significant," Dana said, laying the documents out across her desk in the order I'd found them. "But I want to be very careful about how we characterize this to you, because there's a version of this story where Gerald is simply a controlling man who talked his wife into decisions she wasn't fully comfortable with. And there's a version where this is elder financial exploitation, and the legal remedies for those two things are very different. How do we tell which one it is? We find out what your mother actually understood when she signed these things. And we find out whether Gerald has done anything like this before." The second question turned out to matter enormously. Dana connected me with a private investigator she'd worked with for years, a quiet, methodical woman named Odessa Renfro, who specialized in exactly this kind of background work. It took Odessa less than 10 days to find what she found, and when she called me with it, she prefaced it by saying, gently, that I should probably be sitting down. Gerald Voss had been married twice before my mother. His first wife had died of natural causes, as he'd told my mother. That part, at least, was true. But his second marriage, 11 years earlier to a widow named Carol Ashworth in Greensboro, had ended not in death, but in a quiet, sealed civil settlement after Carol's adult son had filed a petition alleging financial exploitation and undue influence. The case never went to a full hearing. It settled before that, with Gerald agreeing to relinquish claims on certain assets, in exchange for Carol's family dropping the petition and agreeing to confidentiality. Odessa had managed to track down the son, now in his 50s, living outside Charlotte, who agreed to speak with her once he understood what was potentially happening again. He said, Odessa told me carefully, reading from her notes, that Gerald's pattern with his mother was almost identical to what you're describing. Charm at the start, gradual financial consolidation, isolation from family framed as protectiveness, and near the end, right before the family intervened, Gerald had begun suggesting to doctors and friends that Carol was becoming forgetful, confused, unreliable, despite the fact that, according to her son, she never showed any actual signs of cognitive decline until well after the stress of the situation itself began affecting her health. I sat with that information for a long time after the call ended. Not because it was surprising, exactly. Some part of me had already assembled the shape of it, but because it meant my mother wasn't an unfortunate exception. She was a pattern, a second iteration of something Gerald Voss had already successfully executed once before, refined and improved with practice. Donna filed quietly an emergency petition requesting a court-ordered independent capacity evaluation for my mother, along with a temporary restraining order preventing any further transfer or encumbrance of jointly held assets pending review. It was careful, precise language, nothing accusatory on its face, simply a request grounded in documented irregularities and a prior relevant history. The petition also requested that Gerald be temporarily suspended from acting under the power of attorney until the evaluation was complete. This will not go unnoticed by him, Dana warned me. Once he's served, he'll know exactly what's happening. We need to move carefully and quickly. The independent evaluation, conducted by a geriatric neuropsychologist named Dr. Priya Anand 3 weeks before that birthday party, found my mother's cognitive function to be entirely within normal range for her age, with no evidence of dementia, delirium, or any condition consistent with the confusion Gerald had described to her physician in that hospital hallway. Dr. Anand's report noted something else, something that took my breath away when I read it. Several markers consistent with chronic situational stress and mild depressive symptoms, potentially attributable, the report read, to social isolation and diminished autonomy within the home environment. In plain language, my mother wasn't losing her mind. She was being slowly, deliberately convinced that she might be by a man whose entire pattern, twice now, depended on exactly that outcome. Gerald was served with the petition on a Tuesday morning, 4 days before my mother's birthday party. I know this because Piper, who'd started stopping by more regularly under the cover of ordinary granddaughter visits, texted me that afternoon to say Gerald's demeanor had changed sharply, that he'd been on the phone in the garage for over an hour with the door closed, and that he'd told her, a little too brightly, that Grandma was resting and that maybe Piper should come back another time. I understood, at that point, that the birthday party 4 days later was not going to be a simple celebration. Dana understood it too. He's going to try to control access to her right up until the evaluation results are formally entered, she told me. He knows what's coming. People like this don't disappear quietly. They perform normalcy as long as they possibly can. That performance was exactly what I witnessed in that doorway. Gerald's hand braced against the frame, telling me it wasn't a good time. I want to be clear that I could have pushed past him. I could have caused the scene every instinct in me wanted to cause. I didn't, because Dana had told me something I held on to through that entire encounter. Whatever happened Saturday, she'd said, don't let it become about you being upset in front of witnesses. Let it become about the paperwork being undeniable in front of witnesses. Those are very different scenes, and only one of them holds up. So I said what I said. Tell her I'll see her Monday at Dana Okafor's office. And I walked back to my car, and I called Dana from the driveway, and I told her what I'd seen into my mother's face through that gap in the door. The evaluation results are already filed with the court, Dana said. The restraining order on the assets is active as of this morning. Technically, Gerald has no more authority to act on her behalf than a stranger off the street does right now. He may not fully understand that yet. He will by tonight, I said, because I'd caught something in Piper's texts that told me exactly what was happening inside that house while I stood in the driveway. Piper called me 40 minutes after I'd driven away, her voice low and urgent. Mom, there's a notary here, a woman with a folder. Gerald's telling everyone it's for the birthday guest book, but I saw papers, and it's not a guest book. My stomach dropped. Can you see what it is? I got close enough to read part of it. It says something about appointment of guardian at the top. Gerald was attempting, on the same day the court had already suspended his authority, to have my mother execute a formal guardianship designation naming himself as her legal guardian. A document that, if signed and properly notarized before he'd been formally served notice of the pending capacity dispute, might have muddied the timeline enough to argue in court later that the arrangement predated any challenge to his authority. I called Dana from the car, already turning it around in the middle of the road. Go back, she said immediately. Right now. Don't wait for me. Just don't let her sign anything, and call the county sheriff's non-emergency line the second you're back inside that house. Elder Protective Services should already have a case number open from the petition filing. Reference it. This is exactly the kind of thing that number exists for. I made it back to my mother's driveway in 11 minutes, driving faster than I should have. Through the front window, I could see the dining room. The party, still technically underway, though the mood had visibly shifted, my mother's friends standing in small, uncertain clusters near the walls, the way people stand when they've sensed something is wrong but don't yet have the language for it. I didn't knock. I walked straight through my mother's front door, into her own dining room, past Gerald, who started toward me with his hand raised in some placating gesture I didn't wait to interpret. Natalie, this isn't. Don't, I said. My mother sat at the head of the table, a pen in her hand. A woman I didn't recognize standing beside her with a folder and a notary stamp already inked and ready. My mother looked up at me, and in her face I saw something that undid me more than anything else that entire day. Not confusion, but a kind of exhausted, apologetic uncertainty. The look of a woman who has been told, gently and repeatedly, for months, that her own judgment can no longer be fully trusted, until some small part of her has started to believe it might be true. Mom, I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. Don't sign that, not yet. Gerald's voice sharpened. Natalie, you're upsetting her. This is a simple update to her paperwork. It's what she wants. Is it what you want, Mom? I asked, ignoring him entirely, kneeling beside her chair. Is this coming from you? She looked at the pen in her hand like she'd forgotten she was holding it. She looked at Gerald. She looked at me. And in that long silence, in front of 30 people standing frozen around her own dining room, my 75-year-old mother did something I will be grateful for as long as I live. She set the pen down. I don't understand what I'm signing, she said, quietly at first, then again, louder, to the notary directly. I don't understand what this is. I want to stop. Gerald's composure cracked for the first time that entire afternoon. Ruth, you agreed to this Thursday we discussed. I don't remember discussing it clearly, my mother said, and something in her voice had changed, steadied, the way a voice does when a person finally stops apologizing for their own confusion and starts naming it as something that was done to them rather than something wrong with them. I don't remember a lot of things clearly lately, Gerald. I've been wondering why that is. The notary, to her credit, quietly capped her pen and stepped back from the table without being asked. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line from the hallway, gave the Elder Protective Services case number Dana had provided, and within 20 minutes, 2 deputies and a caseworker were standing in my mother's front hallway, calmly separating the situation the way trained people do. My mother in the living room with the caseworker, Gerald in the kitchen with the deputies, the guests, mercifully, ushered by Piper and one of the Bridge Club women out to the back patio with the excuse that the cake needed cutting outside. I sat with my mother while the caseworker asked her gentle, careful questions, and I watched something in her posture that I hadn't seen in over a year. Her shoulders coming down from around her ears, her hands, for the first time that whole afternoon, resting still in her lap instead of folded tight. I kept thinking I was losing my mind, she told me quietly, once the caseworker had stepped out to speak with the deputies. He kept telling me things I didn't remember saying, agreements I didn't remember making. I started to think maybe he was right, that maybe something was wrong with me. Nothing is wrong with you, I said. Dr. Anand's evaluation says so in writing. It's already filed with the court. She looked at me then, and something in her face broke open, not into tears exactly, but into a kind of stunned relief, the specific relief of someone realizing, all at once, that the ground beneath her had been solid the whole time, even while someone spent a year convincing her it wasn't. Then why did I feel so certain I was forgetting things? Because he was telling you that you were, I said, over and over quietly, until it started to feel true. That's not memory loss, Mom. That's what happens to people when someone they trust keeps insisting their own mind can't be believed. What followed over the next several months moved slower than that single dramatic afternoon might suggest. Real accountability, I've learned in 18 years of doing this work, mostly moves through paperwork rather than confrontation. The temporary restraining order on the jointly held assets was made permanent pending a full civil hearing. Dana filed to have the deed transfer on the house reviewed for rescission based on documented undue influence, supported by Dr. Anand's report and, eventually, by a deposition from Carol Ashworth's son in Greensboro, whose account of Gerald's prior marriage established a pattern the court took seriously. Gerald did not go quietly. He retained an attorney, argued that my mother had acted with full capacity and free will throughout the marriage, and suggested, through his counsel, that I had manipulated an elderly woman's fear of her own daughter's disapproval to destabilize a happy marriage. It was, Dana told me flatly, exactly the argument she'd expected, and exactly the reason we'd built the file the way we had. Dated, documented, corroborated by an independent evaluation, and a prior sworn account from another family. The civil hearing, 8 months after that birthday party, did not go the way Gerald had clearly hoped. The court found sufficient evidence of undue influence to void the deed transfer, restoring the house fully to my mother's sole ownership, and referred the broader pattern of conduct to the state's Adult Protective Services Division for further review, given the corroborating history with his previous marriage. There was no dramatic gavel moment. No single satisfying line delivered by a judge. Just a written order, eventually, restoring what had been quietly taken, one careful legal finding at a time. My mother filed for annulment rather than divorce, on the grounds Dana helped her document, and it was granted without significant contest. Gerald apparently having concluded, by then, that further fighting risked exposing more than he was willing to have exposed in open court. He moved out of state within the year. Odessa Renfro, who still occasionally checks in with me the way people do, after working closely on something that mattered, mentioned once, almost in passing, that a woman in a small town outside Knoxville had recently posted engagement photos online with a silver-haired man, whose face looked, in the blurry background of one image, remarkably familiar. I didn't do anything with that information beyond passing along Odessa's professional card to Dana, in case anyone ever needed it. Some patterns, I've come to understand, don't stop on their own. They only stop when someone finally documents them clearly enough that the next family doesn't have to start from nothing. My mother turned 76 the following year in that same dining room, with the same good china, and this time I sat beside her the entire afternoon instead of standing in a doorway being told it wasn't a good time. Piper made the cake herself, badly, with visibly uneven layers that my mother declared, with complete sincerity, the best cake she'd ever had. Somewhere in the middle of that afternoon, my mother took my hand under the table, the way she used to when I was small and we were sitting through something long and boring at church. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "About the accounts, about feeling confused. I think some part of me knew something was wrong, and I was ashamed to say it out loud, because I thought it meant I'd been foolish, marrying him in the first place." "You weren't foolish," I said. "You trusted someone who was very good at being trusted. That's not the same thing." She squeezed my hand. I keep thinking about that word he used, overstimulated. Like I was a child who needed managing instead of a grown woman who'd raised one. I know. I don't ever want to feel like that again. "You won't," I said, and I meant it, not as a comforting thing to say to my mother on her birthday, but as a professional fact I intended to make true, the same way I'd spent 18 years making it true for other families who walked into offices like Dana's not knowing yet what was being quietly taken from them. Later that evening, once the guests had gone and Piper had fallen asleep on the living room couch the way she used to as a teenager, my mother and I sat on the back porch with the last of the cake and 2 cups of decaf neither of us really needed. "Do you think he'll do it again?" she asked. "To someone else?" "I think Dana's making sure the record on him is a lot harder to hide from the next family," I said. "That's about the most any of us can do. We can't stop a man like that from trying. We can just make it a little less likely he gets away with it quietly again." My mother was quiet for a while, watching the fireflies start up over the yard. "I used to think being strong meant not needing anyone's help," she said finally. "I think I was wrong about that." "I think you were the strongest person in that dining room," I said. "You put the pen down." She smiled, small and tired and entirely her own. "I did do that, didn't I?" If there's one thing this whole experience taught me, professionally and as her daughter both, it's that isolation is rarely the beginning of harm. It's usually the middle, the part that makes everything after it possible. By the time someone tells you it isn't a good time to see your own mother, the real work has usually already been happening quietly for months. In paperwork, nobody thought to double-check. In phone calls that got a little shorter every week. In a woman slowly, gently being convinced that her own memory couldn't be trusted. Pay attention to the small things. The calls that thin out. The paperwork someone else has simplified. The moment someone you love starts apologizing for confusion they never used to have. Ask the harder question before it becomes the only question left to ask. If this story felt familiar to you in any way, if you've ever watched someone you love slowly disappear into someone else's version of them, I hope you'll tell us about it in the comments. And let us know where you're watching from tonight. And if you want more stories like this one, about quiet strength and the slow, patient work of bringing the truth back into the light, go ahead and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.